This is probably as close to my normal clothes as my viewers are likely to see. Hi, friends and enemies. Welcome to Horror and Inconvenience. Quick reminder that my amazing theme music was composed by my friend Julie Hardwick, whose link is in the description, so hit her up if you need any music composed for any reason. She is very good at her job. Welcome to the Astounding Science Fiction tag. A friend of mine at work, I work, as anyone who's watched this channel knows, at a bookstore, and I never talk about anything else. A friend at work suggested that I do some tag videos. She said it might be fun to try, and, that got me thinking about it. And then I saw the Astounding Science Fiction tag going around on Michael K. Vaughn's channel, of course. He's the creator of the tag. And he's been praised so highly at this point that I feel anything I say is superfluous, but good channel. I like it very much. I saw Vaughn of Plagued by Visions do it, and a handful of other people, and it was just delightful, so I thought I would jump on the bandwagon. Hope this is good. Question 1 of the Astounding Science Fiction tag is, what was the first science fiction book that you read, and what did you think of it? This is a difficult one for me to answer because I grew up in a family of English teachers, and I have been reading at a high volume since probably before I can remember. But I discussed this at length with my mother, a high school English teacher, and, my BFF, because I am a millennial stereotype. And we determined that when I was little, I didn't read a lot of science fiction. The closest I probably came as a very young child was the books of Roald Dahl. I would argue that some of his books, especially Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and its sequel, The Great Glass Elevator, have heavy sci-fi elements, but they're certainly not part of the sci-fi genre. So that approaches sci-fi, but isn't. So we determined as the earliest sci-fi books I read, probably around 4th or 5th grade, Margaret Peterson Haddix's Among the Hidden and its sequels. This was a proto-dystopian sci-fi series aimed at middle grade readers, so 4th to 6th grade usually. And the premise was that around the world, authorities had decided that there was an overpopulation problem, and so a worldwide one-child policy had been implemented, and the story focused on the lives of hidden additional children who didn't legally exist. Pretty standard sci-fi stuff, but when you're 9 years old, absolutely mind-blowing. Margaret Peterson Haddix is a very inventive and engaging writer. Her work is fast-paced, and her characters are not necessarily complex, but the kind of people who are inherently interesting in and of themselves. So, loved those books. And Margaret Peterson Haddix was a huge hit at my school. My elementary and middle schools, people where I grew up absolutely loved her. The other book that may or may not have been my first sci-fi read was The Giver by Lois Lowry. Still to this day, one of my absolute favorite books. I've read it at least 3 or 4 times, and honestly, it's due for a reread. It is, in my opinion, one of the greatest books ever written, bar none. The odds that you haven't read The Giver if you're watching this are slim, but to refresh your memory, it takes place in another dystopian society where most people are denied most types of memory and experience. They see in black and white, they don't feel strong emotions, and they don't remember the past. And there is a pair of people in this society, the giver of memory and the receiver of memory, generally an older person and a younger person. One of them passes on society's historical memories to the other. And so we follow a young man who is chosen as the receiver of memory and who has to deal with the intense expansion of his world and finding an ethical approach to how he thinks his society should work given the new knowledge that he has. Again, pretty standard sci-fi fare that is absolutely wild when you're 9 or 10. Lois Lowry is a beautiful writer, and I'm not the first person to make this observation. Her work has won a lot of awards. She's also the author of Number the Stars, which is one of the most acclaimed children's books that there is. But yeah, if you haven't read it, shut up, of course you have. But if you haven't read it in a couple of years, give it a reread. It's so good. And I'll reread it with you, you know? Comment. We'll do it together. I want to add here an honorable mention for the Artemis Fowl series, which is really more of a mashup of sci-fi and fantasy, but was absolutely an obsession of mine and my friends when we were little. Artemis Fowl was my best friend, which explains a lot of the problems with my personality, I think. Question 2. What was the last science fiction book that you read, and what did you think of it? I read a lot of things that are on the edge between genres, so it was hard to say exactly which of the last few books I read qualified as science fiction. If we're using a broad definition of science fiction, I read the Murder Trending series by Gretchen McNeil very recently, last couple of weeks. I read books 1 and 2. They're a sort of fun popcorn YA dystopia series. The premise of the first one is that there is a prison island called Alcatraz 2.0 where death row inmates are sent and are hunted down by theatrical serial killers, which is live streamed on an app. It was fun. I couldn't put it down. If you have a more traditional definition of sci-fi, then probably the last sci-fi series that I read was Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. And, I mean, I'm not the first person to have told you, I'm sure, that Binti and its sequels are wonderful reads, and you should definitely pick them up if you get the chance. Binti itself is a very short novella. It's about an African girl. It takes place in a world where the first extraterrestrial contact for the human race occurred in Africa. And she's part of a very insular tribe that, while it has a deep spiritual almost connection with this extraterrestrial culture and with mathematics and science fictional devices, doesn't approve of its members leaving the planet. Well, she decides to leave her society and travel to a university planet called Umzuyuni, and there is an alien attack on her ship on the way there, and I won't spoil it any further. But it is a wonderful series that focuses on female characters from marginalized societies, and that really puts forward restorative justice as a legitimate future for humanity in a way that I found really moving. Question 3. If you love science fiction, what made you love science fiction? Star Wars. But to elaborate on that, my parents were both very engaged with literature and pop culture, but they had different interests. My mom is a very grounded person. She loves a dystopian story, a very political and often a hard sci-fi story as well. She wants a thought experiment out of her sci-fi. My dad, on the other hand, was a huge fantasy fan, and he loved a bombastic, action-packed sci-fi story. So while they both grew up with and loved Star Wars, my dad was the really intense Star Wars fan, and he started me on them before I can remember. He took me to the theater for every Star Wars movie that came out during my childhood. I was 7 or 8 when Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, came out. He went and saw it, and then he took me, and having seen it already, he knew what parts I would find scary, so he told me when to cover my eyes, and we watched it together. This is one of my 3 Padme Amidala dolls. I didn't have them when I was little, so I bought them all secondhand at Slackers as an adult, and I don't regret it. Star Wars really is more science fantasy than science fiction, but I am at heart an intense fantasy fan, and so Star Wars really bridged the gap for me. It made the trappings of science fiction, which aren't usually my favorite part. I had a space phase for sure when I was little until I realized that space was aggressively uninhabitable and became terrified of it. I didn't go on anxiety medication until college, which is a shame. But Star Wars opened up possibilities and made the trappings of science fiction exciting to me in a way that led me further and further into the genre. And I will always be grateful to it for that, and to my parents for introducing me to it. Number 4, what is your favorite science fiction movie? This one was a stumper for me. I actually did some brainstorming, again with my mom. We definitely, as a family, have always really loved the movie Gattaca with Jude Law, which is a very dark dystopian story that takes place under an authoritarian fascist regime. Yes, fascist is necessarily authoritarian. Look, I'm going off the cuff here. You're just going to have to go with me. A fascist regime based on the concept of genetic superiority, which is obviously very bad. It's a very moving and sad film. I have not read the book it was based on. My mom has, and she told me to read it, and I guess that's on my TBR now. But yeah, Gattaca's great. We love Planet of the Apes, which Michael K. Vaughn mentioned in his original video. But for myself, my personal choice, well, it's probably a tie. The first thing that came to my mind was the film version of V for Vendetta. Now, I suppose you could call me a fan of Alan Moore's comics, but to me, the graphic novel of V for Vendetta is not particularly effective. It's definitely not one of his best works, and even his best works have significant flaws. But the film of V for Vendetta is so moving and satisfying. The Wachowskis really went all out. You know, it's them at their best. Nothing against The Matrix, but V for Vendetta is definitely my favorite Wachowski sisters movie. what I love about the movie is that it's one of those adaptations that elevates the original work and also adds to it. You know, V for Vendetta takes place in a fascist dystopia. Again, I really like dystopian fiction. And it centers a queer narrative. I'm having trouble summarizing it out loud because it feels so distressingly prescient. It's one of those movies that gets harder to watch over the years, but since it came out when I was maybe 11 or 12, it's been one of the most foundational movies for me. It has affected me deeply, and I still love it, and I'm still blown away every time I rewatch it. Also, Hugo Weaving's acting is just so much better when you can't see his facial expressions. The other tie for favorite sci-fi movie is another dystopian one, and in this case I'm going to take the series as a whole and say that the Hunger Games movies as a unit are a favorite of mine. They're beautifully executed. So the Hunger Games books and the Hunger Games movies, I think, are each wonderful as an independent unit. And it's hard for me to choose which I like better, but they're certainly different. And the movies have a broader scope, I think. They really take into account what the society of Panem experiences, rather than just focusing on the personal experience of Katniss, which, since the books are in first person, they kind of have to do. They're wonderful to look at, they're engaging, the acting's incredible, the script is well adapted, I think they're beautifully filmed. Basically, they decided to avoid all of the problems that the Twilight movies had, and it worked so well for them. And I'm happy for them. I rewatch them every year, and I love them more each time. Question 5. What is your favorite science fiction TV show? This was another tough one for me, for sure. There's a lot of great science fiction television out there. My first thought, funnily enough, was Buffy, even though that's primarily a fantasy and horror TV show with some sci-fi elements. The sci-fi episodes really stick with you, so that popped into my head. But on the subject of Joss Whedon, certainly Firefly is a favorite of mine. I know at this point that's an old person thing to say, but it's true. Firefly's great. Really though, I think my favorite sci-fi TV show is Doctor Who. I love Doctor Who, and not in an obsessive fandom way. I used to. I definitely had a phase where I watched every new episode when it came out and read fan fiction and all of that, but I'm less involved in the fandom now, and I'm not caught up on the show because I, like everybody, hate Stephen Moffat a lot. But the episodes I have seen of Doctor Who have deeply affected me. It's a very positive show. Not always, but often enough. You know the everybody lives meme. The line from Doctor Who that stuck with me the longest is certainly, I think it's from the 11th Doctor, might be the 10th, when he says that in all his travels he's never met anybody who wasn't important. I think about that at least once a week. It's a wonderful show because it's got a broad positive outlook, but still grapples with some of the darkness of our society. It's a varied TV show. I think it's the same thing with people who say their favorite show is Star Trek. there are just so many episodes. There's so much going on there. There's so much you can get out of it. It's a whole world. And there's always a Doctor Who episode for What Ails You. It's a great show. And yes, Rose Tyler is my favorite companion. I am in love with her, and you're gonna have to deal with that. Number 6. What science fiction book do you feel should be read more often? There really was only one answer to this question in my mind. And that is Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles. Bradbury is pretty widely read. It's true. Most people read Fahrenheit 451 in class at some point. I actually never did. I read it on my own. But to me, Fahrenheit 451 is a fine book, but it's certainly not his masterwork. The Martian Chronicles is a novel made of interlinked short stories that tell the tale of the human colonization of Mars in a way that frames it as an imperialist takeover comparable to Europeans invading and conquering the Americas. It's, first of all, I think pretty far left of what Bradbury normally writes. I read a lot of his work as fairly conservative, and I think the intensity and perspicacity of his social criticism in The Martian Chronicles is just so much greater. It's also very poetically written. I think some of his best writing. And just a wonderful example of what science fiction can do. Of the way that it can criticize current social mores while still genuinely being speculative and looking ahead and opening up possibilities for humanity. It can do both, and it can do both well. And The Martian Chronicles is a great example of that. So yes, a lot of people have heard of The Martian Chronicles, but have they read it? If you haven't, you should. Number 7. What is your favorite science fiction short story? Being who I am, I had to choose something from the 19th century. Several of my favorite science fiction writers are also among my favorite writers in the Gothic mode. So my first thought when I saw this question was that I would choose something from Hawthorne's oeuvre. I'm talking about Nathaniel Hawthorne, of course. Author of The Scarlet Letter, which is more imbued with sci-fi elements itself than you might remember. But in this case, I'm thinking something along the lines of The Birthmark or Rappaccini's Daughter. Gothic stories that take early science fictional elements and add the sublime. Another story along these lines is Poe's Ligeia. Just, I think, a wonderful apotheosis of both the Gothic and early science fiction. There's a lot of alchemical themes in both these writers' works. The idea that science is a kind of magic was a lot more literal than I think most writers take it today. There's been an ever-increasing diversion between those two concepts, but they were still very close in the early and mid-19th century, and that's really evident in the works of Hawthorne and Poe. Finally, the 8th question. The hardest question. What's your favorite science fiction book? Well, I'm going to start with a lot of honorable mentions here. My favorite early science fiction works are, of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which, no matter how culturally conscious you may be of the story, if you haven't read the book, it's so much stranger and so much more chilling than you might even expect. And you probably expect it to be very strange and very frightening. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. It's dark, it's gothic, it's homoerotic, and it has that sort of alchemical gothic vibe I was talking about before. Just at the point of divergence between science fiction and horror. The first two books in the Ender series by Orson Scott Card also deserve honorable mention. Yes, the latter parts of the series do become disturbingly religious and conservative, and Orson Scott Card himself is a problem person. I firmly believe all of that, but Ender's Game and its direct sequel, Speaker for the Dead, are both excellent science fiction. Ender's Game is a great commentary on the military-industrial complex, and in particular how the depersonalization of violence can lead to the creation of a kind of innocent genocidal maniac. It's brilliant. It's so strange that Orson Scott Card didn't somehow de-radicalize himself by having ideas this good, but no, he's still Martin. Yeah, and Speaker for the Dead is a fascinating look at what extraterrestrial biology might look like, and how encountering creatures alien enough from us can challenge the boundaries of what it means to be human and what society is. Wonderful books. Just read those two, though. Skip the others if you can make yourself do it, because you will be disappointed. With those honorable mentions out of the way, my top pick did have to be a Vonnegut book. And I do want to give second and third place to his novels Slaughterhouse-Five, one of his great works, and Slapstick, one of his lesser works, which happens to be a personal favorite of mine due to its intensely satirical bite. But my number one sci-fi novel, and my number one favorite Vonnegut novel, is Cat's Cradle. It's an apocalyptic story in that it takes place almost entirely in the lead up to an apocalypse. And, oh, boy, it's disturbingly prescient. But I think what really makes Cat's Cradle stand out for me is the character of Bokonon, who is a Caribbean prophet who has created a religion based on the fact that religions are false, but you should accept one anyway because it might make you happy. And it's very traditionally, philosophically hedonistic. I'm not talking about, like, wine and orgies here, but about the philosophy of hedonism. And he's just a very funny, fascinating character, and there's something so moving about the combination of this cynical religious movement with the approaching apocalypse. It's just a wonderful book. It's worth every read and reread that you give it. And Vonnegut may have had problems with women, marginalized people of color, and never mentioned queer people, but boy, could he write. So, it's my favorite. There's no escaping it. Oh, also, I forgot to give an honorable mention to the Metropolitan series by Warren Ellis. This is a comic book series. It's cyberpunk. It stars Spider Jerusalem, seen here in action figure form. He's a cyberpunk journalist based on Hunter Thompson, and it's about a violently angry man shouting into the void about the injustices of the world. It's real good. You should read it too. All right, this has been the Astounding Science Fiction Tag. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I don't know. Should I do more tags? Tell me in the comments. I know you won't actually tell me in the comments because I make my own decisions, but I'd like to know what you thought.